Okay, awesome. So, hi everyone, my name's David. I think I met all of you last night. How did the workshop go last night for you guys? Pretty good? Yeah, I think most people finished pretty early, right? It wasn't like a super challenging workshop. And I think that's going to be kind of the theme for these first few days of the boot camp is if you did the Jumpstart program and you thought it was like super easy, a lot of what we're doing this week is going to seem like review to you. And the only reason for that is, well, actually, there's two reasons for that, right? One is because, for every person that, did Jumpstart and thought it was really, really easy, or they, grasped the concepts really well. There are some other folks, who say they might want a bit more practice with it. So for this first week, what we want to do is we want to level set and make sure that everyone is kind of at a similar level, or rather a similar comfort level with certain concepts before we dive into weeks 2, 3, and 4, which will get a lot harder very quickly. And the second reason why we want to take a little more time here with this first week is because what we're teaching in this first week, while it may seem like review, it's so fundamental to what you'll be doing for the next month that if you don't conceptually kind of get a good feel for these earlier concepts, the future ones are going to seem a lot more complicated as they build on top of one another. And so we really want to make sure that when we start off right, and that you guys really kind of know the very, very base levels. And a lot of the things we're going to talk about, especially for today, we talk about things like types. Like these are the things that when we talk about development, like people throw around these terms very casually. So it is very important for you guys to get a comfort, not just in understanding them, but also to know how to talk about them, how to reason through them, and how to use them in a very kind of applicable way. Cool. So before we talk about, kind of the technical concepts, one thing that, Sean and I, didn't cover yesterday, but we want to kind of really emphasize today is just the full stack community norms, right? So basically, what are the rules and the principles that we want to abide by here on the full stack campus? Rather, as a community, what are the values that we stand for and what really matters to us? So the first part is to deal with the class and the workshops, right? So things like be patient, right? It sounds very simple, but and you will definitely hit this wall is software development, especially when you're starting out, and even when you're more experienced, can be extremely, extremely frustrating. Computers are not people, right? They tell you no, and they don't give you a good reason why. And so learning how to be patient and learning how to deal with that stress and that frustration of not knowing what's going on at all times is very core to being a really good developer. So as you program and as you kind of pair through these workshops with your fellow classmates, one thing we really encourage you to do is not just to focus on solving the problem at hand, but also to get a good feel for what it's like to work with other developers. As you move on in your software development career, very rarely will two things ever happen. Very rarely will you ever be working by yourself as a sole developer on a project. More often than not, you'll be working on a huge team with tons of other developers working on things in parallel with you that may affect your code too. You just don't know it yet. And so knowing how to communicate between developers is super important. The other thing that will almost never happen when you start off as a developer is no one will ever give you a blank repo and say, hey, can you build me this app or can you build me this feature? And the reason for that is because almost every developer who starts working on software, you're working on a huge existing base of pre-existing code, right? So there are teams of developers who wrote thousands, if not millions of lines before you. And more often than not, what you're really doing is you're trying to understand what the developer before you did. So yesterday, Sean covered things like comments, like good data, some good syntax, good clean code, right? Why is that so important? Yes, if you write your own code, you might be super familiar with it in the moment, and you can take a look and say, you know what, I don't need comments, I don't need to define all these things. But if you think about the poor developers who come 6 months or a year or 2 years after you, maybe when you're no longer with the company, right? And they're looking at this code and saying, what the heck is the person doing? Like knowing how to prepare your code for the people who come after you, as well as being able to understand what the people before you wrote, is probably as important in terms of being a developer as it is knowing the actual syntax yourself. So to go along with that, I don't want to belabor these points too much, right? But things like ask questions, trust the process, helping each other, having fun, right? These all go hand in hand with working and collaborating with your partner. And as we randomize, the pairings every week, the pairings every day, hopefully you guys will get a chance to work with developers, not just who are different people, but who also have different development styles, right? Different levels of communication, different ways of writing code, how they think, how they communicate. And so, as much as it is about learning the syntax and learning concepts, it's also really, really valuable in this kind of safe space here that we really get a chance to work with other developers in a professional context. So at least you're prepared for that. The other part of the full stack community norms really hinges on one basic idea, right, which is that of respect. Obviously everyone did the JavaScript Jumpstart program, so we know at the core you're a very good developer, right? But a lot of the other things that we really want to be careful about is when you're in this community, it's how we talk and how we talk and how we treat each other, right? These are very important points because these do bleed into other aspects of the program, right? If you've ever had a job and had an unpleasant coworker, right? It wasn't just that they were unpleasant, personally, right? Like that unpleasantness can also bleed into work. And I don't mean saying anyone here is unpleasant, but just what are the things that we want to be careful of, and what are the things we want to be what are the things we want to be aware of and what we mean when we say we want to respect our classmates and respect kind of the classroom environment, right? So things like subtle isms, right? I.e. Sexism, racism, ageism, being professional, kind of going back to helping each other. These are all things that I would say that in most cases, no one's going to explicitly be mean or be or try to be racist or be sexist in any sort of those manners. But some things do come across in a way that maybe it may be interpreted as such, right? Or maybe in some ways we're not even cognizant of what we're saying, and some things might slip out. And so we really want you guys to kind of think about is when you communicate with each other, right? Think of it as coming from a place where you're trying to help each other, right? Like leave no room for error. One of the things that we always get asked when we present these norms is, well, is this, sexist, or is this racist, or can I say this? And it's like, if you have to ask, like try to veer away from that, right? Like think of the edge of a cliff. Like you don't want to get as close to the edge as possible to see how far you can go before you fall off. Realistically, you want to stay away from that edge as far as you can, right? And so the same concept applies here, right? When you want to say something and you're thinking, would that come off as a little bit sexist or a little bit racist or a little bit ageist? Just don't say it, right? Like it's very simple. There are probably much better ways for you to communicate your point across, or for you to get your point across. And so we really encourage people to just kind of keep that in the back of their minds. And the last one is pretty self-explanatory too. If it's something that if you have to, and kind of going back to the earlier idea, right? If you have to ask if it's appropriate, it's probably borderline, it's probably grayish, and in that case, just don't do it, right? Like if it's not safe for work content, don't share it. If it's something that you're not comfortable saying, or if you wonder if you might offend someone, don't say it, right? Like these are all kind of very general, but also very straightforward principles. And so these are the things that we really want everyone to kind of keep in mind as we go through this, these next 3.5 weeks of workshops. Any questions on norms? And one thing I do want to ask questions is I actually like to take like a 10 to 15 second pause, and it might get awkward, but I don't really care because I think usually you want to give people time to actually you want the words to sink in. You want people to have time to sink through kind of what you're saying. So yeah, any questions?
When you say be on time, can we be here before 6:30, or is 6:30 like the earliest we can be?
Yeah, so from a logistical standpoint, the campus is open all day, right? So we have this space from 6:40 to 9:40 every day. If you come early, feel free to grab a seat over here. Feel free to grab a seat in the kitchen, hang out with your classmates. There's really no upper limit on that, but we don't have a dedicated space really for you before class starts. So kind of take that into account. I would say on average, in the previous cohorts, people tend to get here between 6:30 to 6:35 and kind of chill for a few minutes. As you can see, the previous class usually comes in. They can be they're supposed to end at 6:30. Sometimes they might end at 6:35. People usually come in, and by the time people come in, people are just kind of milling in too. And so when they see you guys, they kind of notice they're cute to kind of to head out as well. So yeah. Any other questions? Cool. Awesome. So let's talk about today's lecture, which is on something called types, right? So can everyone see the board, or should I turn the lights off? That'd be better for you.
I can see it.
Everyone can see it? Okay, cool. Yeah, I think for today, because most of these are pretty straightforward, leaving the lights on is fine. But when you turn the lights off, if you want to read like several lines of code, it becomes a lot clearer. So we can try that in the future as well. So on the left is a very strict kind of definition for what type is. And really, the way that I always think about types is kind of, what am I dealing with here, right? Like what data format am I dealing with? There's a few basic types, and they fall into a few classifications. But really, the most important thing to know about data types is how does JavaScript view them, and how can you use them, right? A number and a boolean and a string, to us humans, they might seem like, oh, like they're pretty straightforward to us. Like we might see them as the same thing. The JavaScript engine does not. there are things you can do with a number that you can't do with a string, that you can't do with a Boolean, etc. And so because of this, it's very, very important oftentimes when you look at code is to be able to figure out what data type you're primarily dealing with. And the reason why that's also challenging is because oftentimes we never just use the value itself, right? We capture it in a variable. And a variable by definition could almost be any data type, right? It could be an object, it could be a string, it could be a Boolean. So when you see a given variable, sometimes a lot of errors that you see get thrown out is because people try to do something with a data type that they can't do, right? So if for example, if I want to iterate over an array, right, I can do that with an array. I can't do that with a number, right? Or I can't do that with a Boolean. And so JavaScript usually throws out these warnings to you in terms of saying, hey, this data type, you can't do this with it, right? I'm not going to allow you, or at least I don't recognize what it means to do A with B if A is not a supported function of B. So on the right-hand side, you'll see we define two things, right? We define something called for. We define for in the context of a string, and we also define for in the context of a number, right? When we log out, and by the way, console log, super important here, right? Console log is purely for human consumption, right? Sometimes people say, well, I have my function return back to me this, and I ask them, how did you return it? They're like, well, I console logged it. Like that means nothing to a computer. A computer sees console log as saying, hey, I'm gonna literally print this out, but I'm not doing anything from a technological standpoint with it. And as we talk more about functions and scoping, this will become a bigger and bigger concept, right? So just remember, whenever you see a console log, think of that as having no impact on the computer. That's just printing it out for humans to read. The computer doesn't do anything with a console log, okay? So when we try to console log, when we print out my string and my number up here, to the human eye, they actually look the same, right? They're both 4. But when we try to do operations with them, right? And in this case, we're doing the same exact operation. We're using a plus sign. We actually see that you get two very different values here. When we add the two strings together, what JavaScript is saying is, okay, you have a string here and you have a string here, and you want to add them. What does adding two strings mean? Well, if I give you a word, right, and I give you another word, and I say add them together, the most logical way that humans think about it is I'm going to take the first word and append the second word to it, right? So if I have something, my first word is book, and my second word is keeper, I'm going to give you a word called bookkeeper, right? When it comes to numbers, obviously, if I give you 4 and I give you 4 and I say, hey, add them together for me, you're not going to go into them and say, hey, okay, so I take the 4 and I add the 4 next to it, and now I have 44. But that's exactly what happens when we try to add strings, right? Similarly, when we try to add numbers, JavaScript looks at it and says, oh, you're trying to add a number and another number. Semantically, this means you're trying to increase the value of a given number. And so in this way, making sure that you're defining the right type is super important, because once again, JavaScript will look at this plus sign, as saying, you want me to do something, but what this plus sign means is going to be, what this plus sign represents is going to be very different depending on the data type that you're having it operate on. So let's talk about the types that we have available to us. So up top are the primitive data types. We have numbers, booleans, undefined, strings, and nulls. And beneath it are just what we kind of put in this big bucket called objects. Okay. Does anyone have an idea of what primitive means? Oh wait. Yes.
Not very complex.
Not very complex. Okay, cool. That's a good definition, but it's also very subjective, right? What does very mean?
Relative to other things.
Relative to the complicated ones, they're not very complex. Cool. All right.
It doesn't take up a lot of memory.
It doesn't take a lot of memory. That's an interesting one. We'll come back to that in a little bit too, as to what that entails. Any other guesses on what primitive means? Yes.
It can't be broken down into any subcategory.
It can be broken down in any subcategory. Okay, so you're saying for something like an array, I can have an array of numbers.
Yeah.
Therefore, I can break down the array into numbers, whereas I can't break down a number into anything else, really. Okay, cool. That's a really interesting way of looking at it, too. Any other guesses? All right, so primitive, one way that I like to think about primitive is just means it can't be changed. Okay, and so let me kind of walk you through some examples of what that means, right? If I have a list, and I say, here's a list of like 3 things, right? Numbers 1, 2, and 3. I can take an item off that list. I can add an item to that list. I can take the current first number in that list and increase it by 100, right? And that's all totally fair. I can change that array, right? So in JavaScript, we call that, when we say something is changeable, we say it's mutable, which means we can mutate this fundamental thing, right? I have this object, I have this list, I can change it. The primitive ones I can't change, right? So I'll come back to what that means in a little bit, right? So let's start with something very simple, like a Boolean, like true, false, right? A true is true, a false is false. I can't say, all right, let me add 5 to the true, or let me increment the true, or let me add another variable to the true, right? A true is just true. Same for false, same for undefined, and same for nulls. I think most people grasp those pretty quickly, right? It's like, well, if I'm saying undefined, you know, like I can't change that, right? Like I can't say undefined equals, you know, false, right? Like, because that's not true. Oh, sorry, that's bad semantics there. So Boolean, undefined, and nulls, I think are pretty straightforward, right? Let's talk about strings and numbers. In JavaScript, when we have a number, right, it says 2, right? In the previous example, we had a number called 4, and we added 4 to it, and we got 8. What's really happening behind the scenes, and this is a concept we'll cover in a lot more detail when we talk about what pass by reference versus pass by value means. But when I take that 4 and I add 4 to it, I'm actually not increasing that original 4. What I'm doing is I'm creating a new number. I'm saying that number is 8, right? So my underlying 4 does not change. And if you really think about it, right, it kind of makes sense. Like I have a set of numbers, right? I could change 4 in that instance, but what if someone else wanted to use 4? What does that mean exactly? Well, I can't change 4 for everybody, right? So really, with things like numbers and strings, even though they, to the human eye, it may appear like we're changing those things, what we're actually doing is we're actually creating a new version of them, right? So if I take like something like hello, right? I say, hey, can you take out all the else for me? If I do find some way to do that, and we're talking about ways to do that for a string, what we're doing is we're not taking this actual string and saying, hey, take out the else and give it back to me. What we're saying is, hey, can you create a new string for me without the else? And that's a very important distinction, because if I say change this string for me and you say you changed it, well, guess what? You probably haven't changed it, because the underlying string is still the same value, right? What you might say is, hey, David, here's a new string that I've created that fits your criteria. Just like if I say, hey, add this number for me, you might say, hey, David, here's a new number that's the sum of these two numbers you told me to add, but the underlying number doesn't change, right? 2 is always going to be 2. 3 is always going to be 3, right? True is always going to be true, and in JavaScript, a string is always going to be that particular string, right? So that's why these data types up here are fundamentally different from these data types down here, because guess what? I can change all of these, right? I can add days. We can talk about regex and functions later on in this course, right? But for things like objects and arrays and dates, I can change those. I can't change anything up here, and so that's a big fundamental, I guess, like characteristic of these primitive data types. Does that sit well with everybody?
Sure.
Yes.
So if you have a variable and you assign like one of the primitive data types to it, you can change the variable, but you're just setting it equal to a different value.
Exactly.
Actually.
Right. So if I say like var x is 4, right? I have this variable called x, I have this number 4, and I draw an arrow from this variable to this number, right? If I say, hey, let's add 6 to it, I'm not changing this 4. I'm just redrawing the arrow, so now it points to a 6, as opposed to increment the original 4, right? Numbers cannot change. Strings cannot change. And I think there'll be some workshop problems that you'll get really frustrated about when you try to change a string. So just remember, strings cannot change. You can only create new strings. Okay? Okay, so let's start off with some very basic that are going to be the basis of a lot of what we're looking at, right? Numbers. I think a lot of this is pretty self-explanatory. I'm not going to belabor the point, right? But just know that for numbers, we mean integers, we mean positive, negative numbers. In JavaScript, numbers with decimal points. In other languages, they have a set data type called floats. In JavaScript, they're all just numbers. So basically, everything that you can represent on a calculator is a number in JavaScript. That's just a TLDR version of that. And now, so then what can we do with basic numbers? Well, I think most of these 4 up here, I think, are pretty self-explanatory. The only one that most people may not have seen before with regards to numbers is this thing called a modulus or a remainder, right? And so if I do something like 5 modulus 5, right? Basically means if I divide 5 into 5, what's going to be my remainder? 0, right? And so who can think of a good use case for why we would ever want to use modulus? Yes?
Figure out if a number is even or odd.
Yep, that's a very typical example, right? Is because when I define something by a modulus, when I divide a number by 2, right? Or sorry, when I do a modulus of a number by 2, I can only get 2 possible answers. It's either going to be 1 or a 0. It's either going to be even or odd. And so that's like a prime example of when we use modulus. There are definitely other cases for using modulus too. And as you kind of do more and more algorithmic stuff, you'll start to see some of these patterns and maybe get a little bit more creative with the math. But I think these basic math operations make sense to hopefully everyone here, right? Because I think a lot of this was covered in Jumpstarts in kind of a pretty thorough point. Okay. And then so once again, we're just going to really belabor this point, right? Numbers cannot be mutable, or numbers are not mutable. They cannot be changed, all right? So when I say something like I assign this variable equals 12, or sorry, this variable called num equals 12, I can divide it by 2. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't change the underlying numbers. When I say num plus or equal to, what that really is saying behind the scenes is num is not equal to num plus 2, right? And what that means is we're going to calculate what num plus 2 is, which is 12 plus 2, right? We're going to get a number, and we're going to repoint you to the number 14, right? So once again, we're not creating, yes?
Where's my num? Okay, is that in you, Jared?
I'm sorry?
What's my num?
What's my num?
Yeah, my num.
Oh.
There's 2 variables? Or?
Oh, I guess they didn't clarify that correctly. Yeah, this should be num2. These both 2 should be num
Okay.
as well. We're just dealing with the same num there, but as we kind of go through this. Yeah, so this plus or equals, once again, it may look like we're changing it. We're not. We're just repointing you to a new number. And then plus plus does the same thing. And then finally, when you console log something, obviously, we're not changing it either, right? So for numbers, we can always reassign the variable that's pointed to point to another number, but we can never change the actual underlying number. In JavaScript, 4 is always going to be 4. Think of it that way, right? Like it would make no sense for me to tell you, hey, I can change your numbers to something else, right? A number system is very constant, and what it is what it will always be in JavaScript. Booleans, also again, very straightforward, right? 2 possible values. Booleans can only be true or false, and these are reserved words. What is a reserved word? It means there are a bunch of words in JavaScript and really any programming language that you can't use because they're already defined, right? Words like function, right? Words like null. Like you can't say, oh, I want to make a variable called null, var null equals something. JavaScript's gonna probably scream at you or do something else to your computer. But yeah, so reserved words, and usually if you use a text editor or any kind of, in most coding environments, they'll color code the reserved words for you. So when you type it out, you'll know like, hey, this is like something that JavaScript knows is a word. If you want to get a full list of them, Google it. But I think, honestly, like as you do more and more JavaScript, a lot of those become kind of secondhand. So you'll get a good feel for which words are reserved and which ones aren't. But yeah, never use true or false as variable names ever, because it's bad practice and also because you can't. So cool. And then lastly, null. So null is a placeholder that can represent value that could be something else, but currently it's null, where it's like not there, or it's not like a valid value, okay? Null and 0 and undefined are very different. We're gonna cover undefined next. So just know that null is usually used as a placeholder value, as in I tried giving it a value and I got nothing back. Like, like if I say, hey, if I don't, God, I can't even think of an example off the top of my head. But let's say I'm trying to look in a table for a blank value, right? A lot of times you get nulls back. The database will say, hey, there's nothing here. Here's a null, right? To let you know that I tried looking for it and there was nothing there, which is very different from an undefined. And what an undefined means is I've declared it, right? Like I've tried to instantiate this variable, but I haven't yet tried to give it a value yet, right? Null implies that you've tried giving it a value and the value was just not available or wasn't anything valid. Undefined means I created a variable, but I haven't yet told you what it's going to be, so I can't quite say it's a null because null implies I tried, right? So if I do something like var middle name, right? I don't say var middle name equals anything. I just say var middle name. I've now created this variable called middle name, but I've not yet assigned a value to it. So until I do, middle name is going to be undefined. Yes.
How is null different from assigning a value like parenthesis and quotation marks?
That's an empty string you're saying, right?
Okay.
Well, yeah. So sorry.
Like,
So
how is it different? Like, could you say null and then like later give it a string?
well, so remember. Oh god, let's go back. Click. Okay, cool. Oh. This is a string, right? This is null. These are two data types, right? Like these are similar. We'll talk about what do we mean when we say they're similar in some ways, but at the very root of it, like these are two very distinct things, right? It's like saying like I want a red car and I gave you like a red pencil. Well, they're both red, yeah, but like they're fundamentally different things, right? So don't like so if you see null like so basically so what we're talking about here basically is this idea that sometimes when we say hey is this value truthly or falsely, right? And we'll talk about like what goes into that calculation in a later section. But for now, at least, just recognize that these two are very fundamentally different things, right? An empty string is still a string. It's not a null. Yes?
If you have like an array that's just a string of comments, then is that an array full of undefineds or full of nulls?
Great question. Let's do it. So one of the things that, as a programmer, that hopefully I want everyone here to get in the really good practice of is just, if you have a question about like, hey, I wonder what happens if I do this, just do it. Does everyone know how to use REPL, or does everyone seen REPL before?
Yes.
It's a really great way to just kind of code really in any environment, right? So what your question is, hey, if I have something called, I have RAR, right? I say, hey, I'll just give you like 3 blank values here, and then I console log out ARR. What do you guys think this will be inside of in these values here? Or actually, let's do it this way. So I'll say for, so I'm just going to iterate through this for loop really quickly for you guys, so we can just check this. I think like so the reason why I wasn't showing undefined array was because REPL does this a little bit strangely. Like when it tries to when it sees the collection of things, it just gives you like the highest level categorization of them. But here what I'm doing is I'm going through every item in the list and asking you what data type are you, right? And so in this case, for everything we have in here, they're undefined, right? They're not nulls because it's not like we tried to do anything with them and we got nothing back. We just literally said, hey, you have 3 values. I'm not going to tell you what you are yet. Right? So it's like we haven't tried defining you yet. And so we get back undefined for all 3 of these.
What would you have to do to get them to return null, null, null?
What would you do to get return null, null? I'm trying to think. What's a good way to get nulls back? Let me think on that. I'll get back to you. I feel like nulls are something that like usually like you see like when you ask something for something, or you ask a data type for something else. Off the top of my head, I'm trying to think. I mean, like obviously, like you can literally just call this like null, right? Like that's totally valid.
That's cheating.
That's cheating, yeah. I guess we can't organic see it. And this is, by the way, this is like one of those things about JavaScript that's like really like, it's something we call like an implementation quirk. Is a nice way of putting it. Like a fatal flaw is another way of putting it. Technically in JavaScript, nulls types are objects. Is that me or is that someone? Oh, okay, cool. No, I just want to make sure it wasn't my Siri going off. Okay, cool. But yeah, so we can do that. I'll think of an example for you. We're going to pull up like a null kind of, out of thin air. Yeah, I wonder if we can do like we can do like something like let's see if this does it. Nope, it gives us undefined. Okay, cool. All right, I'll come back to that.
If you try to divide a string by 2, would that do it?
That could do it. What I'm thinking might also happen is it might give you back so what's happening here is when you try to do mathematical operations with things, what JavaScript does is it will first say, hey, is this very clear what I'm trying to do here? And in your case, because you're trying to divide a string with a number, it will actually try to change the format of them in a way that hopefully makes them fit together, right? So if you write, like, for example, if you do something like, Like so for example, here if down here if we say something like, hey, console log out, right? If I say console log out 2 plus 2, I get 4. Pretty straightforward. But if I make it like this, then I get 22, right? And so in this case, what it's doing is actually it's looking, okay, one of you guys is a string, one of you guys is a number. I'll change this number to a string and then add them together. So behind the scenes, JavaScript's also trying its best to kind of guess what you want to do. So it's handy in some cases. It can also be incredibly dangerous in another. So another tenet of programming in general is just always be as explicit as you possibly can, right? You don't ever want to leave anything up to chance. You don't ever want to say, well, hopefully JavaScript will figure out that I want to add two numbers together as numbers instead of strings, because sometimes it doesn't do it, right? And a lot of times, because there's nothing in JavaScript that's telling you, hey, by the way, I'm changing this to a string before I add it together, you don't actually see it, right? You just see the output. And so it can get lost very quickly down the road.
Good question.
Yes?
Now, in your console log line, is there a reason why it converted the number 2 to a string rather than changing the string 2 to a number?
Yeah, so that's also has to do with the implicit. So we have a lecture on implicit conversion and what it does. But essentially what JavaScript does is JavaScript has like this order in which it will try to do things in, right? So it's like, okay, you have, type A and type B, right? If I'm doing operation on these two types, I'll try to do it assuming both are of type B first. Then I'll try with both of type A, and then I might try something else too, right? So there's this huge chart. Let me see. JavaScript loosely equal. So if you ever done anything kind of with JavaScript that requires measuring, comparing two things, right? They always say always use triple equal signs, right? And the reason why for that is because double equal signs also give you the right answer, but does anybody know what the difference is between 2 equal signs and 3 equal signs?
2 compares that they're equal.
And what does 3 do? Sorry, what does 3 equal signs do?
Precisely equal.
Okay, so I heard precisely, I heard equivalent, I heard comparison. Can anybody tell me technically what that means? Yes.
Is it if they're pointing to the same object, or if the value is equal?
Not exactly. Yeah.
I think 2 equals does something called type coercion.
Okay, so type coercion. So what does that mean?
Like similar to how it converted the number 2 to a string. I think it tries to match
Right.
it to.
Right. So type coercion means, hey, before, basically, so triple equal sign is really easy to explain, right? It basically means are two numbers of the same type and they're equal. In that case, there's no kind of ambiguity, right? Like if you're both numbers and you're equal, you're the same number, right? If you're 2 strings and you're the same string, if you're both strings and you have the same text in them, you're equal. Double equal signs does this really, really funky thing where it says, okay, let's first check to see if that holds true, right? If it is, great. If not, let me try to do some type coercion on my side to say, hey, if I make you a string instead of a number, are you guys equal then, right? And the reason why that's super dangerous is, so where I'm going here is this is like the Mozilla Foundation's basically way of, is it in this one? They basically write documentation on what JavaScript is, and it's really dangerous because there's this huge table that tells you exactly what it does, and it's like absolutely, like this table here, I'm not even going to zoom in on you guys because just read this and know that like if your first value is this and your second value is this is how they're going to compare you. And so for every data type with every combination, it's just a little bit different. And it's different to the point where it's not rational for any human to memorize this. So it's a good rule of thumb, don't use it. Okay? This is why you should never use double equal signs, because unless you can meticulously remember all of this and know exactly what happens when you try to compare a Boolean to a string, don't do it. Right? So double equal signs are terrible because they do all these things behind the scene that you don't see, and so you don't actually know what's happening, which is super dangerous. If you do ever need to compare anything to be very loosely in that, you do the conversion yourself, right? If you say, hey, if this is also a string of 2, I want you to pass it, then you convert it to a string first yourself, and then you do a triple equals compare, right? Never ever let JavaScript do the comparison for you, because what JavaScript does is it does operations that you don't see and you might not be aware of. Cool. Any other questions?
Why did
Yep.
return true for the no?
For the no,
So yeah, it's a number of undefined objects and then true.
that's from this thing here. Does 2 double equal 2?
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah. Sorry. So Okay, so once again, everything in white, console logs for human consumption, right? This green is what this function is returning. Okay, and if you don't define anything, every function will implicitly return undefined to you. Unless you say, hey, return back this thing for me, this function will always return back undefined because every function is going to return back something. In this case, throughout this page, I don't return anything, right? I say, hey, can you log this out for me? Can you log this out for me, etc., etc. So the computer says, I'm really happy to log out all these things you asked me to log out, purely for the fact that you want to see it. Remember, console logs do nothing for the computer, right? It's only for human use. I'm logging out these things for you because you asked me to, but at the end of the day, you're not telling me to return anything, so I'm going to give you back undefined. So this undefined just means we don't have a valid return statement in this. Any questions? Any more questions? Sorry. Cool. All right, so we are not on this slide. Oh God. Okay, cool. So nulls, undefined, and then finally we get to the last of our primitives, strings. In JavaScript, you can be very flexible. You can use single quotes or double quotes. The only thing is you need to be consistent. You can't open one up with a double quote and close a single quote, or vice versa. Whatever you open with, it has to be closed with. And so the reason why some people may use one over the other is because, hey, what if I want to type out a single quote, right? Well, if I use double quotes to be kind of the parentheses almost to my string, I can write whatever I want in the middle there as long as it's not a double quote, and it'll be fine. So if I need to type out a single quote, let me make my string double quotes so I can type the single quotes in the middle. Vice versa with double quotes, right? If I make my outside string like single quotes, I can write double quotes inside of this, and JavaScript will say, well, this is part of the string, right? Because it's between the two single quotes. So just be consistent with how you choose to define strings. Once again, strings not mutable. We cannot change the string. We can read from it. I can say, hey, what's like the sixth letter of the string, and it will tell you. If you say, hey, can you change the sixth letter of the string to something else, it won't do it for you. Or rather, it will unfortunately not tell you no. It just won't do it. Like you'll run the function, it'll be like, great, I ran, and you'll check the string and nothing's changed. So strings, also not mutable.
How would you try to change it in such a way that, what would the syntax for trying to change it? What way?
Yeah, so what you would do, so there are a few ways to change the string, right? So let's just say I want to, get rid of this H here, right? What I could do is I could split this string up into two parts and say, let's recreate a new string with the first 4 letters here and the last 6 letters there, and we skip the letter in the middle. So we can recreate it from scratch. That's one way to create that's one way to create a string.
Right, but I mean, what you're saying is you can't use the string you can't use a string as a variable. That's what you're saying. You can't say quote hello equals quote hello.
Yeah, no. Well, yeah. So strings just. I mean, you really don't want to use like a variable name is just going to be it's like a variable type almost. Like so, are you asking me like, can I do something like var hello, like this? I think JavaScript just won't let you do it that way, right? So if I say something like var str equals 1 2 3 4 as a string, this is totally cool, right? And I say, hey, can you console log out for me whatever string the first letter in string is? It'll say, great, it's a 1. Say that's great. And then if I try to say something like, hey, by the way, can you change your first letter to like 0? It'll say, great, it's a 1. Right? So like this is why this can get a little bit tricky / dangerous, is because if you noticed, oh god, this can get a little bit dangerous because I tried doing this, it didn't do what I wanted to do, but it didn't really throw an error for me. It just says, oh yeah, I did it for you. And then you log out, it's like, nope, it's like, tricks on you. Cool. So with most programming stuff, like when you get an error, usually like it's a good thing. So like at my current job, right? Like whenever we run these huge data processes on terabytes worth of data, getting an error is a really good sign because it means something broke and you can pinpoint to exactly where it's breaking, right? If something runs like very smoothly on the first try, we're all like, holy crap, like it went through. Like, what does that mean? If something broke, where can we possibly find the things that break? Because as you do more and more development, you also get more and more paranoid, and you start thinking that nothing you do can ever work on the first try. So you almost want to see some failures to know that you're like going down the right path. But yeah, so silent. So this is like it's not like a failure because from JavaScript standpoint, I didn't fail it. You asked me to do something, and I did it. It didn't work. So yeah. Cool. All right, so that's strings, and that's going to be the last, I think, of our primitive data types. Any questions on those before we move on to the non-primitive ones, the complex ones? Yeah.
Is not a number a primitive type?
Yes, it is. It's not a number is a number.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like JavaScript does things where it's like, oh, why? Well, so JavaScript has some implementation mistakes. Why don't they fix it? Any guesses why they don't fix that?
That was all the code previously written with it would become unuseful.
Exactly. People build technology on top of other technology stacks, and so there's a bunch of code out there in the world that says, hey, I need to rely on the fact that not a number is a number for my code to work. And if JavaScript push out a change overnight, it will be super easy for them to do it, but then everyone's code is going to break, and then no one's going to use JavaScript anymore. So as a language, like this is why like building out the right language is super tricky because you have to future-proof on your own behalf against like bad use cases. And so there are some mistakes in JavaScript. If you go on these threads, like people just have like really angry rants about JavaScript, like, oh, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. Which, by the way, there are inconsistencies in every single language, right? There's no perfect language. Every language has their quirks that people are like, this clearly should not be the case, but it just kind of is. So the not a number one is kind of like one of those. You can make an argument for why it should still be a number type, but you know, it's kind of like colloquially saying, nah, a number is a number, and if you're like, right, like no one really likes that. Cool. Any other questions? Awesome. Concatenation, yeah. So we saw this a little bit, right? But basically, adding two things together. When we do it with numbers, we're doing math. When we do it with strings, we're literally just joining up two strings together. So really, what it comes down to is be careful about what you use and what data types you're using it with, because in different contexts, the plus sign take on different meanings. Accessing a string, right? So earlier, I showed you guys super simple to say, hey, tell me your first letter, tell me how long you are, etc., right? What does this notation remind you of here? This square bracket. Sorry. Right, but what is it like? What other data type does it remind you of? An array, right? I'm saying, hey, what's the first element? What's the third element, etc., etc. Once again, it's not an array because you can't mutate it, right? But you can read it like it's an array, right? It has a dot length property. It has indexes for each individual letter. So you say, give me like the sixth letter, it'll just give it right back to you, right? So very straightforward. This is something that hopefully you've had a little bit of experience with, but as with arrays, as with strings, really I think across all languages, the index always starts at 0. So the first thing is always 0, and then it goes to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So that's why when we access an array, when you look at most loops, they always start at 0, is because usually people want to start at the first element and work their way down. If you start at 1, what you're really doing is you're actually starting on the second letter or the second element, so to speak. So that's just like something that with practice you'll get a hang of. Just always be cognizant of the 0. Okay, and then the last thing here for this is built-in string methods, right? So string actually has a bunch of things that JavaScript says, hey, we think you probably need to use this as you kind of go through a string. I'm not going to read through all these to you, but I mean, I think the names are pretty self-explanatory, right? Change them to lowercase, change it to uppercase, split it in half, find out how long it is. In this case, convert it to a number, or at least try to convert it to a number, right? Like these are all things that are built into all strings, and so for us to use it, it's literally something as simple as to say, let me just delete all of this up here so we don't have so many distractions here, and then say, hey, console log out for me. I could say str.length, and it'll give me back what? 4. Cool. I could say, or I could even say something like, I could write it like this. Or I could write it like this, right? Like that's still a string. It's not in a variable form, but it's still a string data type, right? A variable just points to it. So heck, why not just go directly to it, right? So these are all perfectly valid ways of doing this. And then if I try to do something like, if I try to convert this to a number here now, it's going to give me back this number. But what if I try to say, something like this? What would I get? Sorry? Meh.
Not a number.
Exactly. You get not a number. Which we just to prove. Oh look, it's a number. So bad JavaScript. But yeah. So that's kind of strings in a nutshell. Strings are like a lot of especially a lot of interview problems are built around the idea of strings because they're not mutable. But you can access it like you would a list, and so a lot of problems are kind of built around are you someone who's aware that you can treat strings like an array, but you can't change it. So just like a small tidbit. And then the last thing here is the type of, right? I just showed you guys what it does. But it will tell you exactly what data type something is. Obviously, this last thing here, we say oddly, but it's just maybe you could argue it's bad implementation on JavaScript side to call null an object. But these will all give you these things. And the only other thing to be careful of is, go back to the very first slide here, or the third slide here. We distinguish between arrays and objects here, but really everything here is what we call an object data type in JavaScript. So if you want to find out something is an array, there are ways to do it, and we'll cover them. Cover a few ways to figure out something is an array. But if you just do type of an array, you can get back object, right? Which sometimes doesn't quite tell you if it's an object or an array. So just be careful of that wrinkle as well. Cool. Any questions on these primitive data types? Primitives, can't change them. Just gotta live with them or reassign them. Yeah, what's up?
Go back a few slides to where you declare a variable.
Where I declare variables in a lot of these.
I think it's more forward. So yeah, on the right side you said variable middle name.
Yep.
Usually, for example, later on in this code, if we were to write some more, right? We can't use the variable middle name to store arrays in it, right? For example, if we were to do that in the future code, we'd have to say middle name equals empty braces.
Cool. All right. So tell me what to type, and I will type it for you, and then we will together figure out exactly what's happening at each stage here. So I'll take the first initiative and say, okay, we create a variable called middle name, right? We don't assign anything. We console log it. I get undefined.
Yeah.
Now, where do you want me to type and at which line number?
Wait, I'm sorry, your question?
Oh, sorry. So you asked what will happen if I do this afterwards, right?
Yeah.
So tell me what to do, and we'll do it together.
Say middle name dot push, a string. You wouldn't convert a middle name to an array, right?
Sure. See here. So something like this, right? Do this, and then I try to console log out middle name again. Okay. Well, I mean, kind of gave it away, but basically what it's saying is, and this is kind of the thing about data types. Certain data types lets you do certain things, right? Arrays lets you push. Undefined doesn't let you push. Numbers don't let you push, right? So in this case, you're trying to push, and I'm not sure if you can see this error right here. I'll copy it over. But what this basically says is, and this is the good kind of error, and it's very, very clear exactly what it says, saying type error cannot read property push of undefined, right? Because middle name is undefined, and it's saying you can't push anything. So nothing happens. If I 4 lines later I say, hey, by the way, middle name is equal to an empty array here. Obviously this is not code. Cool. Then it's all cool. Then it's saying, great, do whatever you want to do, right? But until I define it with something that has a .push function, just says can't do it.
So I guess my follow-up question is, as a good practice, when we declare a variable,
Yeah.
do you want it to is it better to say variable middle name equals 0 if you want to use it as a number? Variable middle name equals like empty quotes if you want to use it as a string, or just leave it as variable middle name?
Yeah, so it's gonna vary a lot based on what you're actually writing, right? Because here's the thing about JavaScript, right? That like, if you notice, like, middle name can be anything, and we can change it to anything else we want to change it to, right? So we can make it a number at the beginning, but then change it to an array 3 lines later, and it's totally fine, right? So in that example, I would almost say, why don't we just assign it when we actually need it, right? Because if at some point if you say, hey, I need to push into an array, well, I would say, great, let's make an array. We need to make an array, right? There's no kind of benefit to holding off. Whereas in some other languages, you might need to say, we declare a variable, you tell it what type it is right away, and then you can't change it ever again. So in that case, you might want to say, hey, I want to be careful and say this is a number, this is going to be an array, whatever. In JavaScript, I can make a number first, change it back to an array, change it back to a number 5 lines later, and it's all fine. Yes?
What happens if you take a number and then make it an array later? What happens to the initial value? It gets stuck in the 0 slot, or?
Yeah, totally. So you're saying I have our middle name, I say make it 0, or make it like 6 or 5, right? And I say middle name is equal to an array, and then here I start as 5, then I make it a 0. What happens to that 5?
Yeah, so the initial value gets erased.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And erase is like, it's erased in the sense that you can't really find it again. And so normally so this is a very interesting problem in a lot of computer programming languages, right? It's like, hey, how do I switch two variable values, right? So let's say I have something called like, I have, something as simple as, var a equals 3. No, 3. All right, it shouldn't be that hard. Cool, and then var b equals 4, right? How do I switch those two values?
Are you asking us, or?
Yeah, tell me what's type.
I mean, you make a temporary variable and you say A1 equals B, and then B equals, I can't even do it in my head. Right. So var A1 equals A.
Okay.
Okay, and then so now B equals A, B or equals A.
Okay, b equals A.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go on. And A equals A1. Is that gonna work?
Let's check it.
I won't do it in my head. I have to do it to you.
Right. So let's the best way to do this is let's console log it out, right? This is why I love programming. We don't have to argue. This is like, hey, let's just log it out, see what happens.
No, I got it backwards. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Well, so I think the missing kind of link here is that this is not assigning. This is comparing. So this is asking you, is B equal to A, not set B equal to A. Right. So if I say something like this now, B is equal to A, and then A is equal to A1. Now this will still be backwards. I think what we want to say B is, we want to say A is equal to B first here. And then we want to say B is equal to A1. There we go. And that will
I don't know
switch.
why I use that 3 equals thing. I'm normally much smarter.
Right, but yeah, so basically all this to say that like once you kind of deassign something, you do lose like a reference to it. Like you can't really say, hey, wherever you used to be, can you give that back to me? And they'll say, nope, I have no idea where I used to be, right? So before you leave a value, if you want to store somewhere else, always make sure that you like store it somewhere, right? It could be something as simple as this, right? Making a temporary variable to say, hey, can you hold on to this value for me while I do some other operations? I'll come back and get you when I need to. Because if you don't store it here, when you set A is equal to B, you kind of forever lose your reference, whatever A was pointing to, whatever A was pointing to previously.
Is there a reason it's not giving you error messages for leaving semicolons off, or it just doesn't?
No, it doesn't. Semicolons is, I guess, it's best practice in a lot of cases. And semicolons do play a role when you're talking about like semicolons are really useful when you're trying to figure out when the end of a page is. And so when something goes through like several pages of JavaScript in a row, knowing where the semicolon is, sometimes it helps like the reader basically figure out, oh, this page ends here, so these functions truncate to the one above it and the ones beneath it. Whereas you don't, if you don't have a semicolon, sometimes it goes through and says, oh, like this is all just like one really big thing. So that's like a nuance of it. But in your case, like for now, just for shorthand, I'm not typing semicolons. And just know that semicolons is not necessary in JavaScript. But it is oftentimes best practice to use semicolons, if nothing else, and to make your code a lot more readable for the people coming after you. I want to say that the way JavaScript does this is like, okay, so in this case, you do need a semicolon because you're doing 2 assignments in one row. Basically, what the semicolon tells it is, hey, here's like the end of like a line of an operation, and then start the next one, right? So here, if I say this, the reason why JavaScript doesn't like this particular syntax here is because it says, hey, David, I have no idea where your first operation ends, your next one begins, right? But if I put a semicolon here, this is all cool because then it says, okay, I know you first want to execute this block of code, and then you're going to execute this block of code. So semicolons are useful in that context too. In general, use them, but just know that if you see JavaScript without semicolons, it will still run and compile. It's also a good way to know that you're dealing with JavaScript. Any other questions? All right, cool. We'll get started on the workshops then. Feel free to take a 5-minute break, go to the bathrooms, do whatever you want to do. I'll psych out the pairs for the groups, and then when you and your partner are both back, feel free to get started. Myself and the fellows will be walking around, answering any questions you may have. And then one thing I also like to do is at the end of class, depending on how people are doing with time management stuff, if we have time, we'll just walk through the workshop problems together. So as a group, we can kind of see how you guys maybe solve the problems that could be different than another group in the class. And we talk about different solutions and kind of work towards the optimal one. Sound good? Cool. All right, take a break, and then I'll cycle the pairs now.